They called it a seminary, but beneath those stained-glass windows and sermons carved in stone was a vault, not for relics, not for saints, but for secrets. Secrets they paid to forget, secrets they never expected you to find. Let's begin. You were never supposed to hear this story. Not in school, not in church, and certainly not from any museum in Virginia. Because what happened at Sterling Seminary wasn't history. It was architecture. A structure of control, a factory for silence from 1787 to 1823. 247 sons of America's most powerful families entered the seminary gates. None returned. And yet, no bodies, no funerals, no inquiries, just tuition checks. And perfect silence. You need to understand this wasn't a cult. It wasn't some backwoods tragedy. It was a system approved, protected, and most chillingly, it worked. Father Edmund Sterling didn't preach salvation. He manufactured obedience. The kind of obedience that makes a son forget what he saw in his father's ledger, forget the midnight knock at the tenant's door, forget the screaming, because here's the truth. Sterling Seminary was not built to redeem, it was built to erase. Erasure in 3 stages. First, isolation. Second, confession. Third, reprogramming. And it was all legal, backed by tithes, shielded by robes, enforced by bloodlines. The students believed they were atoning for their sins, but it wasn't their sins being cleansed. It was their families, their fathers, their dynasties, and what those dynasties feared most was not God's wrath, but exposure. Why do you think no one talks about this place? Why do you think it took over 170 years and a cracked wall during renovations for the first documents to surface? Because the families that sent their sons to Sterling didn't just sign enrollment forms, they signed away their pasts, and they paid to keep that silence generational. You won't find this in textbooks. You won't find it in church records, but you will find it in whispers, passed down by caretakers, gravekeepers, and the rare old man too stubborn to forget. This isn't just a horror story. This is the blueprint of how power protects itself, and you're about to see how far they were willing to go, to stay clean. Do you feel that? That tension in your spine? That's not fear. That's the sound of forbidden memory waking up. They didn't just disappear. They were rewritten one by one, name by name. Each boy who entered Sterling Seminary didn't just lose his past. He became a vessel for the sins of others. You see, the seminary's true genius wasn't in erasing records. It was in perfecting the mask. A new personality, forged through silence, shaped by chemicals, and sealed by confession. Confession. That word was everything to Father Sterling. Not because he believed in God, but because he believed in leverage. Imagine it. A frightened 17-year-old boy, torn from his home, shamed by his family, made to kneel before a man dressed as a priest and told, "You are the problem. You are the reason they suffer. You must tell me everything." But he wasn't confessing his sins. He was confessing theirs. The uncle who trafficked humans, the father who forged land deeds, the cousin who vanished a witness, and all of it was written down, catalogued, filed, copied. Sterling's study was not a place of prayer. It was a vault, every file a weapon, every testimony a leash. And here's the brilliance. The more secrets a boy revealed, the more deeply he bound himself to silence, because once you give away your family's darkness, there is no going home. Now listen closely. This next part is not for the faint of heart. After the first month, the students were moved from the main halls to the East Wing. No parents were allowed there. No visitors, only Sterling and his inner circle. There, the boys were broken methodically. Sleep control, speech drills, isolation in stone rooms with no windows, food removed, then returned, then removed again. And every evening, a cup of wine, warm, sweet, but always the same, mixed with laudanum, precise doses, enough to relax the body and fog the mind. By week 6, most of them forgot why they had come. By month 3, they thanked God for being there. This wasn't reformation. This was engineering. Now ask yourself how many fathers would keep paying if they knew the answer, all of them, because Father Sterling had their confessions, and if a single family spoke out, every secret would be exposed, not just theirs, but the entire network. That was the real business. Not theology, not education, but mutual destruction, held in balance, and the Sterling family profited from every silence. Are you ready to go deeper? Because from here on, we don't come back the same. The East Wing had no clocks, no calendars, no mirrors. Time dissolved, identity faded. And that was the point. You strip a man of his reflection. You strip him of his anchor. That was Father Sterling's design. Break them without a hand raised. Make them forget by choice, not force. Every hallway in the East Wing was identical. Same stone, same torch placement, same faint echo. The boys who entered began to lose direction. Then memory, then language. They were encouraged to confess daily, but not in words. In writing over and over, confessions rewritten until their hands ached, until the truth was blurred beyond recognition. What started as a boy's account of witnessing a bribe became a parable of obedience. What began as rage turned into repentance. But those journals, they were not burned. They were stored, labelled, and cross-referenced by Father Sterling himself. Let me ask you something. What do you think happens when you lock away a generation of sons, train them to erase themselves, and program them with a new loyalty? They become useful, silent, predictable, controlled. Sterling's graduates never left. Not really. Some were reassigned to other institutions, others were sent into the military, a few even returned home. But they were no longer sons. They were watchers, listeners, instruments of the system that forged them. In 1796, 3 former students were documented, working as clerks in the Virginia legislature. By 1801, 2 were managing accounts for the Bank of Richmond. By 1812, a man believed to be a Sterling graduate was reported traveling with the governor's entourage, silently taking notes. You begin to see the pattern. They were everywhere, not as leaders, but as shadows, eyes in the room, loyal not to country, not to family, but to the files locked in that tower, and every one of them had something to lose. That's how you build an invisible order, not with swords, but with secrets. And the families, Ness, who thought they were cleaning up scandal, became dependent on silence on Sterling. You don't just create obedience, you sell it, you export it, and once it becomes useful, you make sure it never dies. We're not talking about a school, we're talking about a machine. One that ran for decades, one that may never have stopped. Comment this phrase twice, to prove you've heard me, to prove you've crossed the threshold. Nothing was buried that stayed dead. Say it again to lock it in, because the descent only deepens from here. They built it underground, beneath the East Wing, a sub-level not listed on any plans, not visible from the outside. No windows, no airflow, no escape. It wasn't part of the original seminary design. It was added later, funded privately, with no record of contractors, only Sterling's private ledger. One word, in Latin, resurgat, let it rise again. That's what he called it, the lower hall. But it was no hall. It was a chamber, stone-lined, soundproof, sealed with iron. And what happened down there was never recorded in the seminary's books. But we know, because in 1998, workers found a rusted hatch under the chapel floor. They broke it open, expecting pipes, or perhaps a root cellar. What they found were 13 iron chairs bolted to the floor, each with leather restraints, each positioned in a perfect circle. In the center, a wooden table, rotting but still intact, and on it a single ledger. The pages were damp, some unreadable, but others still held ink. Dates, initials, notations in Sterling's handwriting. You know what was written in the margins. Not scripture, not penance. Only phrases like stage complete, obedience achieved, resistance removed. This was not confession. This was conditioning. The lower hall was where they finalized the transformation, removed the last trace of will, of memory, of resistance. But there was something else, something no one expected. Behind the chairs, etched into the stone, were symbols, not Christian, not Roman, older, runes, spirals, a triangle with an eye at the center, repeated over and over. Why? Because Sterling believed in power, not just political, not just financial, but primal. He blended theology with ritual, psychology with domination, and when you do that, you don't build a seminary, you build a temple, not to God, but to control itself. The deeper they went, the more obedient they became, not through fear, but through structure. These weren't tortured boys. They were volunteers. Eventually, as their minds slipped and their new programming took hold, and when their fathers came to visit, they smiled. They recited lines. They shook hands like puppets. Sterling didn't hide it. He displayed it. Because no one wanted the truth. They wanted the performance, the illusion that their sons had been fixed. But what they got was something else entirely. Eyes that didn't blink, smiles that didn't fade, and voices that echoed with someone else's will. We haven't reached the bottom yet, not even close. In 1803, something changed. A letter arrived at a plantation in Albemarle County, hand-delivered, unmarked, no return address. Inside was a single page, no greeting, no signature. Just this: he remembers the river, he remembers the barn, he remembers what you buried beneath the oak. It was enough. The family froze their accounts, called off all visits, sold their shares in the East India Company, and relocated to New York within the week. What scared them wasn't the content of the message, it was the implication. Someone inside the seminary still had their son's memories. Sterling hadn't erased everything, and he had started to use it. This was the next evolution. Blackmail, not petty, not for money, but to reshape the balance of power. He began sending letters, quiet, specific, targeted, hints, names, dates, sins whispered from confessional booths years earlier, now being used like currency. One father, a judge in Williamsburg, received a sketch of a bridge, with a boy beneath it, a reminder of an unsolved drowning. Another, a merchant with connections in Boston, found a drawing of a ledger marked with invisible ink, only visible under firelight. The figures matched a shipment of slaves he claimed had never existed. Sterling was reminding them, nothing was forgotten, only leased. And that's when the donations began to double. New libraries, new towers, an entire new dormitory wing funded anonymously. But nothing was anonymous. Not to Sterling. He had built a new model, not just for obedience, but for power extraction. The seminary was no longer just a facility. It was an intelligence agency, a black vault of generational crimes, and every page could destroy a legacy. Yet no one spoke, no one reported it, no one burned it down, because they were all inside it now. You understand, there is no return from this. The deeper you go, the more it binds you. And still, the records say, not a single body was ever recovered. But in 1811, a storm uncovered something behind the east wing. A root system, torn apart by lightning, revealed a cavity beneath the earth. Inside, 6 sets of clothing, neatly folded, covered in wax, no bones, no names, just robes, student robes, identical, perfectly preserved. And inside one pocket, a note, soaked, faded, but readable. It said, "They are not asleep, they are listening. They are not asleep, they are listening." That single sentence terrified the men who read it in 1811, but they buried it again. Literally, the note, the clothes, the cavity, all sealed in brick within 12 hours, and the workers sworn to silence under threat of ruin, because if they were listening, that meant they were still alive. Somewhere. And Sterling. Sterling said nothing. No sermons, no warnings, just locked the East Wing for good, claimed it was under structural renovation, and moved his operations deeper underground. They called it the Retreat Hall. But there were no records of retreats, only transfer logs. Boys moved from dormitory A to B, then off the books entirely, and once they entered Retreat Hall, they stopped writing letters home. The families, too proud to ask, too guilty to demand, kept paying. Now hear this. This next part was not known until 2006, when a hidden ledger was found inside the wall of a collapsed wine cellar. Its contents shook even hardened historians. In that ledger, written by Sterling's own hand, was a column labelled Echo Units. Each name, each student, assigned a number: Echo 3, Echo 7, Echo 12. Not students, not people, but echoes, replicas, constructs of identity, programmed responses, and the final column, next to each name, a single word: deployed, reassigned, activated. You understand, Sterling wasn't just creating obedient sons. He was creating a network, a distributed intelligence system, loyal not to any family, but to the seminary itself. And when they were ready, he sent them out to cities, to banks, to courts, to seminaries of their own. Echo 17, assigned to a small Episcopal academy in Rhode Island. Echo 21, posted as a legal clerk in Philadelphia. Echo 9, last known location, Washington, D.C. This wasn't education, it was infiltration. And by the time anyone began to ask questions, it was already too late. Sterling had rewritten the elite from W. Thin. What does it mean to be a father, when your son now serves the very system you feared? What does it mean to build a legacy, if the foundation beneath it is rotted with silence and submission? These families were no longer just victims, they were prisoners of their own secrets. And the sons, if you can still call them that, became carriers of a program, a theology of control, whispered in candlelight, etched in stone. And now you're hearing it too. The descent is not over, because the roots are still moving. The echoes were not machines, they were not robots, they were men, but hollowed, restructured, purpose-built. They remembered faces, not feelings. They recalled events, but not the emotions tied to them. Every memory filtered, every instinct redirected. By the time they re-entered society, they were no longer a threat to the families who sent them away. They were assets, you see. That was Father Sterling's ultimate brilliance. He didn't destroy rebellion. He absorbed it, redirected it, weaponized it. He turned blackmail into trust, punishment into privilege, and to ensure loyalty, he used what no one suspected: blood. The files found in 2006 revealed one more thing. Buried in the back, past the financial records, past the confessions, a list of donors, not money, not land, blood donors, fathers, uncles, brothers, giving samples voluntarily, for medical study, or so they were told. But the timing is what matters. Blood given, weeks before their sons were reassigned. What was Sterling doing with it? And then there's this. In 1815, a doctor named Elijah Trauman was summoned to the seminary under strict secrecy. His letters, discovered years later, detail a strange request. Sterling wanted Trauman to develop a method to verify identity, without names, without paperwork, something biological. Trauman called it the soul print. He believed that under certain conditioning, a man's pulse response, breath pattern, even tone of voice, could be synchronized to his confessor. In effect, every echo would be tethered to Sterling himself, and it worked. One test account, an echo in Maryland, responded to Sterling's voice, through a written sermon hundreds of miles away, with a physical reaction, increased heartbeat, loss of balance, and temporary paralysis. That's not conditioning, that's programming. And it meant one thing: they were never really free, even after they left the grounds. Even decades later, they remained linked like a SIG. Now waiting to be activated, which brings us to the most chilling entry. In the 1819 section of the ledger, a single line beneath the echo list, Phase 2 approved. Sterling continues in absence. Absence, because in 1820 Father Sterling vanished. No funeral, no grave, no obituary, just gone. And yet, the programs continued. The donations never stopped. The echo reports remained on schedule. So ask yourself, if Sterling disappeared but the control never ended, who took his place? Who sits at the center of the circle now? They say Father Sterling died in 1820, but no body was found, no witnesses, no record of departure, just an empty study and a letter sealed in wax. It read, "If power must be hidden, let it wear the robes of the dead." Within days, a new figure emerged at the seminary. No name, no background, no introduction. The students were told Father Sterling had transcended, and this was simply continuation. The man wore the same robes, spoke in the same cadence, even signed letters with the same initials. But he wasn't Edmund Sterling, and yet the echoes obeyed him without hesitation. It was as if the will of Sterling had passed into another. Now you tell me, what kind of obedience survives death? What kind of programming endures beyond the grave? This is when the files refer to him only as the custodian, no face, no history, just that title. And under him, the seminary changed again. The towers were sealed, the chapel boarded, new construction began. Below, a second sub-level with no surface access, only reachable by a spiral stair, hidden behind the altar. Workers brought in, blindfolded, paid in silver, not asked for names. They called it the listening room. Its walls, copper-lined, its ceiling, inscribed with a star that matched no religious symbol. Its purpose, unknown. But in 1832, a boy named Daniel Wexler managed to escape. His journal, found in a sealed attic in Pennsylvania, described the room in exact detail. He said, "They made us sit in silence for hours, while the custodian whispered prayers, in a language we didn't know, not Latin, not Greek, something older, and during those sessions," he said, "the boys would begin to weep, not from fear, but from revelation, as if they were being emptied." He wrote, "When I left that room, I no longer remembered my mother's face, only the custodian's voice." Understand this, we are not talking about education or even indoctrination. We are talking about erasure, followed by replace. Meant not by violence but by reverence, these boys were not being punished. They were being reborn into something designed. The custodian's purpose was not to continue Sterling's work, but to finish it. And if you believe this story ends in the 1800s, you're not listening. We have 12 sections left, and everything you think you know is about to turn. By 1840, Sterling Seminary had no enrollment records, no financial statements, no public sermons, and yet the lights were still on, the candles still burned. A man passing through Henrico at dusk described the chapel windows lit with a red glow like blood behind stained glass. He said he heard chanting, low, rhythmic, almost mechanical. When he asked locals what it was, they changed the subject, refused to speak. One man finally whispered, "It's not a school, it's a furnace." What was being burned was never wood. And then came the deaths, not at the seminary, but outside it. Fathers, uncles, bankers, men who had once sent their sons to Sterling began dying in their sleep. Perfectly healthy, then gone. Autopsies showed no trauma, no poison, only one common detail. Each man had a marking, etched just beneath the skin on their chest, a symbol, barely visible. The triangle, with the eye, the same as the listening room. By this point, there were rumors of a signal, a sermon. Read aloud in certain churches that triggered something in the echoes, something buried, something ancient. And those who betrayed the silence, those who tried to speak, began to vanish. This is when we learned the truth. The echoes weren't just obedient, they were connected, a network of men raised in silence, shaped by confession and bound by something deeper than loyalty, a shared frequency. In 1843, a fire broke out in a private library in Baltimore. Among the ruins, a single page survived. The page was dated 1795, and at the top, the words, Liturgia Obedientia, the liturgy of obedience. It contained no scripture, only a pattern, tones, cadences, phrases. It was not a sermon, it was a code, designed to synchronize minds, to align thought, to strip will, and it matched word for word the nightly prayers at Sterling. They weren't prayers, they were programming sequences, and now we must ask, how many churches, how many boarding schools, how many halls of government echo that same cadence today? What if Sterling didn't vanish? What if the custodian never left? What if the furnace never stopped burning? And what if, even now, you can still hear the voice? By now, you're beginning to feel it, not just the story, but the pull, the weight, the question behind every word. What else have they buried? And what part of you still believes this isn't real? Let me be clear, this isn't folklore, this is framework, the same framework that trained boys to forget, now trains men to obey, not with chains, but with structure, not with guns, but with shame. You think you're free, but look around, look at the systems, the rituals, the symbols, rebranded, repurposed, but still the same. Do you think the echoes died? They didn't. They multiplied. Each generation, a new layer, not born in seminaries anymore, but in offices, in think tanks, in non-profits, different robes, same programming, and the core principle never changed. Obedience through guilt, transformation through silence, control through confession, every time you hand over your data, every time you say yes without reading, every time you keep quiet, because it's easier. That's the liturgy. Sterling didn't need to live forever, he just needed the formula to replicate. And now, it's global, the custodian. He's not one man anymore. He's become institutional, a ghost in the policy, a whisper in the boardroom, a voice inside your own hesitation. And what about the echoes? They don't even know they're echoes anymore. That's the final layer. You build a world where the programmed program others without ever knowing it. And in the center of it, still locked beneath Sterling's chapel, a vault remains. We don't know what's inside. The 1998 team that found the hatch was disbanded, the documents sealed. 3 of the researchers vanished within months. 1 left a note. It said, "If you've seen the vault, you've seen yourself." That's what this story is, a mirror. And if you've followed me this far, then I need you to comment again, twice. Nothing was buried that stayed dead. Because after this point, we stop looking at the past and start looking at the present. Look around your world, the words you say, the decisions you make, the fears that keep you still. You think they're yours, but what if they were planted? What if you were shaped long before you were old enough to choose? Because that's how this works. The most powerful systems don't demand your obedience. They make you think it was your idea. Sterling understood that. The custodian perfected it. In 1856, a boy named Aaron Mallory left a note inside a hymnal. It was discovered a century later. In the ruins of a condemned church outside Richmond, the note read, "I thought I was learning to be a better man, but I was being hollowed out, one verse at a time, one verse at a time." That's how they do it. Through repetition, through rhythm, through ritual, and every echo, every disciple of silence was made to believe that obedience was love, that forgetting was healing. And here's what they never told you. The echoes weren't recruited, they were inherited. passed down, bloodline to bloodline, a genetic contract. Because by the late 1800s, the Sterling Seminary had one final evolution. Selective breeding, only sons from targeted families, only boys whose fathers had passed through the program, only minds that carried the right. Chemistry. You think that's impossible. You think no one could coordinate something that vast. Then explain this. In 1873, a shipment of communion wine was intercepted, headed for 3 different boarding schools, all connected to Sterling alumni. The contents were tested and laced with microdoses of an opiate cocktail, refined, precise, and patented under a fake pharmaceutical company owned by descendants of the custodian circle. The goal wasn't sedation, it was calibration. To prepare young minds, to make them more suggestible, more synchronized, more aligned to the tone. And if that sounds familiar, it should. Because now you carry your programming in your pocket, in your feed, in your you. P-dates, every scroll, every click, every targeted phrase tunes you to the liturgy and the echoes. They're not just men in robes anymore, they're influencers, therapists, CEOs. Even the voices in your head telling you not to question. That's the final obedience, silencing yourself, but not you, not anymore. Because now you've seen it. You've stepped behind the curtain. Sterling didn't die. He became a template, a psychological structure, a ritual framework, encoded into generations of systems, religious, educational, legal. He was never meant to be a man. He was meant to be a method. In 1901, an anthropologist named Felix Harrow visited Henrico to study what remained of the old seminary grounds. The main building had burned in 1894. The official report blamed lightning, but the locals said otherwise. They said the fire moved from the inside. Stone blackened in patterns, symbols scorched into the walls. Harrow's journal describes something chilling. He found a section of the basement untouched, and in it was a wall of names, carved by hand, row after row, each name followed by 2 dates, one a birth, the other not a death, but a designation marked initiated. He traced the earliest to 1787, the latest to 1893. But beside the final name, instead of a second date, there was only a word, ongoing. That name was not a student, it was E. Sterling. Harrow didn't publish his findings. He disappeared a year later, last seen boarding a train in Delaware. His trunk was found abandoned. Inside, more journals, and a note. It said, "He lives in those who forget they are his." You don't have to believe in ghosts to understand the ghost in the system. Sterling became the ritual, the cadence, the formula. And here's where it gets worse. The custodian was not the only successor. He was the first of many. A network of figures, hidden behind titles, rotating through key institutions. They never appear in history books. They leave no trace. But policy, language, codes, and they all speak the same. Even now, if you listen closely, you'll hear the same tone. In corporate trainings, in sermons, in speeches, a rhythm of obedience, and the phrase that always signals them is one you've heard before. For your safety, that's the mask now. Sterling wore robes, they wear concern, but the function is unchanged. And obedience through fear, loyalty through confusion, transformation through silence, and the men who run this world still send their sons into those halls, different walls, same darkness. If you think you've escaped it, look again. Look at your habits, your hesitations, your hidden guilt. Sterling isn't buried. He's installed. They weren't content with obedience. They wanted continuity. Sterling's model was never about one generation. It was about inheritance, legacy, transference of control. By the early 1900s, the echoes had evolved into something else. Not followers, but engineers. Men trained not only to comply, but to recreate the system wherever they went. In 1912, the Harbridge Act was quietly passed through a Virginia subcommittee. It allowed private religious schools to create psychological development programs without federal oversight, no review, no inspections. The man who drafted it, Arthur Hale was an orphan, raised at a boarding institution near the original seminary grounds. He wore a small triangle pin with a single eye at its center, the same design found burned into the Sterling vault walls. Hale went on to chair 3 education boards, establish 2 testing organizations, and consult on military psychological operations during the First World War. His private letters, only declassified in 1986, included a phrase repeated often: "The program persists," in the form of the host, not student, not citizen, host, because that's how they began to see us. Not people, not souls, but vessels, to carry the structure, a code, a pattern, a liturgy. And this is where it becomes clear. The echoes were never meant to stop at obedience. They were designed to reproduce it, through words, through media, through systems that feel neutral, but are anything but. Take note, 1917, Introduction of Standardized National Testing created to identify intellectual potential, but also to classify compliance thresholds. 93. Formation of the National Guidance Council, advised schools on student behavior, founded by men with ties to Sterling-linked trusts. 1931. The Quiet Curriculum Initiative, mandated nationwide, removed philosophy from most public schools, replaced with civics and protocol, and every one of these initiatives traced BR back to donors, families, institutions, with lineage that pointed straight back to Henrico. You must understand this. The seminary burned, but the architecture survived, because it was never made of stone. It was made of obedience, guilt, and unspoken fear. Now ask yourself, have you ever hesitated to speak the truth, even when you knew it? Have you ever silenced your instinct to keep the peace? That's not coincidence. That's the inheritance, the psychological liturgy you never chose to receive, but now you're waking up. The vault beneath Sterling Seminary was never built to be opened. It was built to radiate, a chamber sealed in stone, lined in copper, positioned at the intersection of 2 ley lines, with acoustics designed to carry sound not out, but in. By 1944, military intelligence knew about it. They had mapped it, photographed it, and sealed it again. Why? Because what they found wasn't a room. It was a transmitter. At the center of the vault, a chair, carved from a single piece of petrified wood, strapped with leather too old to identify, facing a wall of mirrored glass, behind which, nothing, a void, and on the floor, a spiral, with symbols etched so deeply they couldn't be sanded down. Not runes, not language, but patterns, designed to fracture thought, to shatter linear memory, to make the mind fold into itself. They brought in a test subject, unknowing, a lieutenant, smart, stable. After 14 minutes inside, he forgot his mother's name. After 21, he couldn't speak without whispering. After 27, he began writing in a language no one could translate. He died 3 weeks later, of cardiac arrest, in his sleep, no trauma, no signs, but his last words were recorded, and this is what he said: "I see the voice now. It's not a person. It's a rhythm that lives in the silence. That vault was not a storage room. It was an origin point. The voice that trained the echoes, that rewrote the boys, that whispered through generations. It didn't come from Sterling. Sterling came from it, and the custodian was its servant. That's why it had to be sealed. Not to protect us from what was inside, but to prevent us from becoming what it created. But the seal, it's not perfect because echoes don't die, and the tone still exists. In corporate trainings, in algorithmic audio, in lullabies you don't remember learning. It's not about words anymore. It's about vibration. Every time you hear a certain frequency and your spine tightens, every time you're told to stay quiet, and your body obeys, without knowing why. That's it. That's the transmission. And you've felt it before. You just didn't know its name. They tried to break it once. Just once. The year was 1952. The town, Braxton Ridge, Virginia, population 341, located just 40 miles from the ruins of Sterling Seminary. Braxton Ridge was small, quiet, unremarkable, except for one thing. It was settled by former students who had left the seminary before the programming was complete. Men who walked away half-broken, still carrying fragments of what they'd seen, what they'd heard, what had been done to them, and they had one thing in common. They remembered the tone, but they weren't loyal to it. They feared it, fought it, and for the first time in 150 years, they began to organize, not against the church or the school, but against the signal. They called themselves the Refusers, and their plan was simple. They would build a counter-frequency, something that disrupted the resonance, unwound the cadence, snapped the spell. They worked in silence. No phones, no radios, only paper, only human memory. They created a device. Rough, mechanical. They called it the Discord box, and they tested it, first on livestock, then on themselves. The results were violent, pain, nosebleeds, nightmares. But then something else. Clarity, one man wrote. After the box was activated, I remembered the day I was taken. The prayer they used to make me forget came back. Backwards. They were close. Too close. Because on the morning of August 19th, 1952, Braxton Ridge ceased to exist. No fire, no flood, no plague. Just silence. All roads blocked. Military presence. The official story. Chemical leak from a nearby mine. But satellite imaging decades later showed something else. The buildings were still standing, intact, empty, beds still made, plates on tables, books open on desks, but not a single person ever found, as if they'd been lifted, erased, and the only thing left behind, in the church basement, was a burned-out device, melted copper, cracked dials, and a note, written in blood, on the floor. It said, "The voice came through anyway. You need to understand. You can't fight this with weapons. You can't argue with it, because it doesn't speak through logic. It speaks through rhythm, through memory, through the architecture of your own guilt, and that guilt is the doorway. The doorway isn't physical. It's not hidden in stone or buried in a vault. It's inside you. They don't need chains. They don't need prisons. They need guilt, shame, fear of disobedience so deep. You build the cell yourself. And that is where echoes are truly born. Not in seminaries, not in schools, but in moments. The moment a boy sees truth and is told to forget it. The moment a man feels rage and is told to swallow it. The moment a question rises and the world answers with silence. Each of those moments, a cut, a fracture, a reshaping, and slowly you begin to speak like them, move like them, think like them, not because you were trained, but because you were carved. The Sterling Seminary didn't build followers. It built mirrors, and every echo you meet isn't just a man. It's a reflection of who you were supposed to become. If you had kept obeying, this is the moment they never wanted you to reach, the moment of remembering. Because once you see the mechanism, it can't stay hidden, not in language, not in architecture, not in tradition. Look at your life, your habits, your obedience. Why do you wake up at the same hour, eat the same food, tell the same lies to keep things easy? That's the liturgy, not just a ritual, but a rhythm of surrender. And now, let's talk about the voice, because it's not just sound, it's shape. And in 1971, a man named Dr. Lorin Castaneda attempted something forbidden. He created a sound map of 50 religious sermons across 12 denominations, fed them through a tonal recognition AI, and isolated. A common root frequency, not a word, not a phrase, but a shape, a wave. It showed up in every sermon, every time a congregation reached silence or submission, and when inverted, that same wave produced nausea, vertigo, panic attacks in test subjects. He called it frequency E echo. He tried to publish, he vanished 6 days later. His house burned, but not his tapes, because in the ashes one Earl remained unscorched, and written in marker across the top was a single phrase. It's never the voice, it's the silence it creates, and that silence is what they use to control you. This is where it changes, where the story turns from history to prophecy, because if everything I've told you is true, then somewhere there had to be a man who broke the silence, who didn't become an echo, who refused the cadence, who became a signal, and there was. His name was Samuel Griggs. Born 1948, son of an oil attorney, educated at Calverton Institute, one of the final feeder schools tied to Sterling's alumni network. From the outside, he followed the path, polished, obedient, brilliant. But on the inside, he was fracturing. At 22, he published a thesis that made no sense. It wasn't academic, it was emotional. The title, How to Kill a Voice Without Making a Sound. It was rejected. He was expelled. Within a year, he'd gone off-grid. What came next was not a manifesto, not a rebellion, not a movement. It was quieter than that. He began sending anonymous letters to families of former seminary students. Simple phrases. Your son remembers more than you think. The altar was a transmitter. The custodian lives in protocol. Most were ignored, some weren't. One man, a retired judge, shot himself 2 days after receiving the letter. Another, a railroad magnate, renounced his estate and moved to a monastery in silence. The system took notice and moved to erase Samuel Griggs, but you can't erase a signal if it's already been broadcast, because Griggs did one final thing before he disappeared. He recorded himself, reading the full sequence of the liturgy of obedience, backwards, slowed down, distorted. The result was a voice that shook men to their core, a pattern that didn't hypnotize, but shattered the trance. The audio surfaced in 1984, on a pirate radio station, for 37 seconds, before the frequency was pulled, but in that moment, thousands heard it, and something changed. Reports came in from across the country, men waking up screaming, women remembering dreams from their childhood, children refusing to spare. For days, the broadcast had done something, cracked something. The echoes were never meant to hear their master in reverse, because in that reversal there was freedom, but also a warning. If the silence breaks, the voice doesn't die. It adapts. They knew the old ways wouldn't last. They knew stone walls would crumble, that confessionals would be replaced by screens, so the custodians adapted. They built a new seminary, but not in the woods, not behind gates. This one was invisible, and you're inside it. Right now. Because after the 1984 broadcast, after Samuel Griggs cracked the trance, the echoes began to splinter. Some went mad. Some forgot who they were. Some began building. Again, a silent war began. Not with bullets, but with algorithms, with silence, with suggestion. And by 1991, they completed the next vault. Digital, cloud-based, encrypted beneath religious non-profit architecture. The liturgy was rewritten. This time, as a behavioral model injected into user experience, embedded in terms of service, disguised as personalization. The platform you trust the most speaks in the tone Sterling wrote, but without ever using his name. They don't need sermons anymore. They need feed loops, endless scroll, rhythms that feel like choices but aren't. You think you're deciding. You think the outrage is real, but it's part of the pattern. Keep you afraid, keep you ashamed, keep you from remembering. That silence you feel. Every time you hesitate, before saying what you truly believe, that's not fear of being wrong. That's fear of being alone, because the voice told you. If you speak, you'll be abandoned. That was the final evolution. They no longer needed to lock boys in stone towers. They taught men to police themselves. Now they sit behind foundations. Tech firms, educational boards, and the custodians are no longer priests. They're policy advisors, moderators, engineers of experience. Every click is a prayer, every silence a confession, and the most obedient echo is the one who thinks he's thinking for himself. But you're not like them. You've stayed with me this far, which means you're not asking what's true, you're asking what's next. Griggs knew he wouldn't survive, not after what he broadcast, not after what he uncovered, but he didn't run, he didn't vanish, he planted. In 1992, a package arrived at a small AM radio station in Montana. No return address, no explanation. Inside, a single reel-to-reel tape, unlabeled, and a small, handwritten note. It said, "Play this only when you're sure you can't forget." They didn't play it right away, not for months, but when they did, the air went still, the signal distorted, and for exactly 2 minutes and 44 seconds, everyone tuned in heard the same thing. Not music, not words, but a pattern, a pulse, like a heartbeat, mixed with static, layered over low, guttural chanting. It wasn't loud, it wasn't clear, but it felt alive. Within 24 hours, the station lost its license. The tape was confiscated. The 2 engineers who aired it resigned, moved across the country, never spoke publicly again. But here's the twist. Someone recorded the broadcast, not digitally on cassette, old school, and in 2011, that recording surfaced on a hidden forum dedicated to deep psychological conditioning. They called it the refusal signal, and every time it's uploaded, it's removed within hours. But those who hear it describe the same thing. They don't remember what they heard, only what they felt, like something had lifted, like someone else had been inside their mind and left. But the real mystery is what was embedded beneath the sound, a data pattern, a cipher encoded in the frequency. Audio spectrograms reveal a shape, a spiral, twisting into itself, at its core, a number, 247, the exact number of students who passed through Sterling Seminary and never returned. And beneath that, a phrase, "We are not lost." That's the key. That's the signal. Griggs didn't just reverse the voice. He created a counter-rhythm, one that doesn't command, but disrupts. It doesn't tell you what to do. It reminds you what you already knew, before the programming, before the silence. This is the final truth, not the story of a seminary, not the rise of a family, not even the history of psychological control. It's the story of you, because if you've come this far, you already know. Something in you was never fully asleep. You were born into silence, trained in obedience, conditioned to fear your own voice. But something cracked. Maybe it was the dream that wouldn't fade, the memory that never made sense, the quiet shame you couldn't name. It was your alarm, because the refusal was never just a broadcast. It was a frequency you were born with, buried but burning, and every system that tried to shape you knew it was there. That's why they feared you, why they pushed you harder, why they isolated you, labeled you, corrected you, because you were the signal they couldn't erase. The real echoes aren't the ones who follow. They're the ones who wake, who carry the counter-rhythm in their breath, who see the pattern and choose not to obey it. And here's what terrifies them most. You don't need a tape. You don't need a vault. You don't need their permission to break the chain. All you need is awareness and action. One moment of truth, spoken without shame. One question asked, without apology. That's the rupture. That's the crack in the cathedral. Because once enough men break silence, the system begins to shake. The tone begins to decay. And Sterling, the custodian, the voice, they lose grip. Not through war, but through memory. You are not a follower. You are not an echo. You are a signal. And signals spread. So now speak the phrase twice. In the comments. To lock your transformation. To mark your awakening. Say it. I am the signal. I am the signal. And let them hear it. Because they're listening. Always listening. But for once, so are we. And now, we speak back. Welcome to the refusal. Welcome to the rhythm. They can't erase. The Sterling Seminary was a lie. But you are the truth they feared. And now, you remember.